I'm John Quinn, Director of Science and Product Development at FlowJo. My email address, as shown on the screen there, is john.flowjo@bd.com. Feel free to contact me with questions. This webinar will be posted to our webinar page. I just see I can't hear anything. Hopefully that's because I was muted up to 1 minute ago. Let me know if you continue to not be able to hear anything, although I guess me saying that wouldn't help. We'll type back here to Li Fang. Anyway, this webinar will be posted to our webinar page shortly after we complete it for anyone who likes to see the recording. Okay, I am going to focus mostly on the mechanics of doing spectral compensation in FlowJo, as opposed to diving into, say, the theory of what spectral compensation is compared to anything else. I'll just briefly say that spectral compensation can be done on essentially any cytometer. It's just the idea that if you've got more detectors than you have measured parameters, then we can collect signal in all of the detectors and use the amalgamation of that signal to create the total picture of that parameter. So the differences here then in FlowJo will be that we will want to set up FlowJo to use all the detectors, but create a smaller number of parameters. And so let's go about doing that. All right, I'm getting out of PowerPoint, as all I wanted to use PowerPoint for was to give my email address. And I'm going to move right into using FlowJo. Okay, so we will go through two examples here. The first one here is a BD-FAC symphony. It's a 9-color experiment, but we had a 20 detector symphony set up. This is FlowJo version 10.6.2. Spectral is available in any versions. Geez, when did we put it in? 10.5, I guess, and onward. Yeah. So clicking on the comp group, as you will do for doing traditional compensation, we'll see that I've got a comp control for each one of the 9 colors in this experiment. I have gone to the trouble of drawing a cleanup gate on these data, knowing that there is one file that uses CD14 as the antibody that needs a second cleanup gate. And so taken care of, one adjustment made. Okay, I'm going to hit the compensation button. If you've got more detectors than parameters, you're going to be prompted to choose which it'll call it parameters. We should probably clean up the language on that. Okay, we have a raised hand. Oh, you know what I should have mentioned, if you have a question, I have the chat box open. Go ahead and type any questions you have as we're going through into the chat. And I'll keep an eye on that throughout, as we've got, wow, so far over 100 attendees and growing. Could be loud if we all chit chat at the same time, so I will keep my eye on the chat box. All right, so boxes popped up. We've got the list of all the detectors here, and because this is spectral, I want to select them all. Make that easy, just pick them all, choose selected parameters. You will notice that there was a little box there that also said remove height and width versions of the parameters, which you will usually want to do, so that you don't end up using a parameter twice, both the height or the width functionality of it. Okay, so I've got this big list at the top, where again, 20 detectors, only 9 parameters, and so most of the detectors don't have anything assigned to them. At this point in FlowJo is going to try to figure out what the best parameter to assign each one of the comp controls is. Because it's spectral, you're going to, again, use all the detectors. What we really just need to do is limit it to how many parameters you have. Pairing them with any particular detector is fine. The primary one is the best. We should do that automatically. If you just right-click on any of the boxes here and choose to remove the unused parameters, we'll pare this list right on down to a detector for each parameter, just so that we're going to now create one gateable parameter. We've got a question from Oliver on whether we're able to remove autofluorescence with this module. So not currently. We're looking into the math behind it. So I think the idea with the autofluorescence subtraction is that you either need to do it on a per cell type basis, as different cell types will have different autofluorescence, which is some tricky math that could be slow, or remove about an average autofluorescence. We may put the latter in. I think maybe the jury is out on whether that's good science or not, but I think people are leaning to tend toward wanting to do that. So I think that is what we will end up doing in the end. So not yet, Oliver, but possibly in the not too distant future. Okay. So at this point, we've got each of the different controls, and we would like to show still an example of what counts as positive for that color and what counts as background. Manisha, I see the raised hand. I will say for questions, just type something into the chat box. I've got it up and I will answer. Let's see, did you compare the way this way of compensating with 9x20 versus 9x9 matrix? Oliver, I think we can do that right here while we're talking. Okay, so let's see, scrolling through the data. And I will say, by the way, just in case, I have it done already too. If we want to jump ahead at any point, we can. All right, we may want to expand the scale, I think, on one of those right here. T button, customize access. Let's get that on scale. All right, nice. Zoom is in the way now of moving that plot. There we go, can do that. Scrolling through the rest of it, might want to make that peak a little wider. So we'll still make sure that the AutoGate algorithm has done a decent job of figuring out what the peaks are. Same as any other comp in FlowJo, so I just keep having to resize these to get them out from behind the zoom controls. Okay, maybe another resize. Just make sure we have the bulk of that peak in there. Okay. Wish I could hide those zoom controls. Okay, and then there's one, the CD14 gate that didn't have a negative. I'm going to just drag in the negative from the unstained for that. Okay, it'll have to do. Okay, so I think that is good for our setup. If we want to do compensation traditionally, we could leave spectral unchecked. So we could say traditional and view the matrix. And that'll calculate in a few seconds there. Okay. We could come back in here, turn on spectral. Maybe I'll call this spectral. Say view matrix there. That will calculate a second matrix. All right. And then the third thing we could do is optimize, but I guess let's take a look at these first. So I'm just going to expand this out. And so we'll notice right off the bat, the difference between traditional and spectral is that traditional will, of course, limit you to a square matrix, where spectral will have a rectangular matrix because we've got all the detectors versus all the parameters. We can turn off the uncompensated. We can choose our one fully stained sample here, and we can preview it on a cleanup gate to take out some of the junk. Cool, and perhaps we want to go in here and maybe change the transform just a little bit. Actually, let's apply the compensation first so that we can actually see these compensated and pick a good transform value. Okay, sorry, maneuvering around zoom controls. Okay, yeah, we got a few events jammed up on the axis, and I bet that's probably going to be true for most of the colors. Let us go in, expand the width basis just a bit. Okay, cool, and refresh that. Click on something else, click back on it. Okay, so that's our spectral matrix. This is our traditional matrix. They're going to be okay. There's going to be a little more red, and there's just going to be a little bit more funkiness in the traditional one, especially I think if we look down here, it just spreads a bit more. The spectral does a nicer job of compressing some of these populations and tightening it up. And if we want a metric on how much better it is, so far we are using the spillover spreading matrix. If you calculate your compensation in FlowJo, as opposed to on the acquisition software, whatever came with your cytometer, you'll notice that the SSM button is lit up here, as opposed to grayed out if it was done on the acquisition cytometer. We can click SSM and either display it or export it. So SSM is spillover spreading matrix. So sorry, on behalf of the entire industry, sorry that we've got the spillover matrix and the spillover spreading matrix named so similarly, even though they're very different things. Spillover matrix right here, how much, and speaking in traditional terms, how much of a specific fluor is spilled over into not the primary detector. And the spillover spreading matrix, how much spreading error we think we're going to see imparted due to that spillover. So if we display this, we've got another heat map matrix. This is heat mapped from white to red, where red is more spillover spreading, so more is worse in this case. Just quick rule of thumb from looking at a lot of data, if you've got numbers under 5, that's really nice. From 5 up until you hit double digits, that's varyingly okay, getting worse. And if you hit double digits, that's probably a parameter that's going to be pretty tough to separate background from single positive and so forth, single positive from double positive. Got a handful of slightly over the limit double positives there. And maybe the best way to just quickly overall assess the whole matrix is to look at the sum of the SSM, which is 192 at this point, 192.89. If we flip to spectral and ask for the SSM, then we've reduced our SSM total score to 170. We've also reduced the number of values that hit that threshold of double digits, bringing all these down into the 8s to just 1 at a 10.8. So we've improved the number of combinations that are below that, my personal limit of a value of 10, and overall the matrix. Let's see, we have a Q&A question. Where is there expressing a pattern on a single stain? Would we be able to define the positive negative populations efficiently? Okay, so the question I think here is basically, what if your comp controls don't have a strong positive and negative? So FlowJo will do its best there, speaking for all of us, will do its best to create positive and negative gates, even on comp controls that don't have strongly defined positive and negatives. We will clearly have more trouble on that than by really nicely, cleanly defined peaks. And this is probably also the moment to mention that you can do your best to make your comp controls easy. If you've got a color that's giving you a big spread, a not so clear peaks, that might be the opportunity to swap in some beads, use comp control beads at that point to get really nice clear peaks that are super bright and make your job easier. Okay, let's see. Could you explain, another question here, that the SSM is not the same, assuming that the spreading is linked to revelations of the assay inaccuracy? Not the same as the spillover matrix, I assume. So if that's the case, then yes, the spillover matrix is just a measure basically of the percentage of light collected in a detector that came from one fluor versus another. Whereas the spillover spreading matrix is basically an equation that looks at the spread on a single positive population compared to the background population. And so the bigger that spread gets, the more your single positive. So if we look into some of these plots, things with like a big spreading, maybe here, the bigger the SSM number is for, say, this parameter interaction, the more this population spreads towards the double positive and the harder it is to see those and gate those properly. If it just is a big smear, it's just hard to trust even an FMO control at that point to have done a great job of figuring out exactly where background or single positive end and where positive begins or double positive begins. Okay, so the other tool that I want to show here, now that we've done traditional and spectral, and I hope what I've shown is that if you've gone to the trouble of setting up this experiment of producing a great series of compensation controls, you've brought them in, it's no more difficult to do spectral compensation in FlowJo than it is to do traditional. It's really just a matter of checking the box and at some point having cleared out the detectors that were superfluous in terms of the number of parameters just to get down to the right number of parameters. The other thing that I would like to show at this point is that you can then optimize. And so let's leave spectral on, but let's see, make it spectral dash optimized, give it a different color. not black, let's go with a green and say optimize weights. And so up here, it's going to say this progress bar is based on 50 iterations. However, we'll typically converge a little quicker than that. So what we're doing here is deciding that not all of these detectors are even. Some of them have a lot more signal from a variety of different colors pouring into them. Others have signal from maybe just 1 or 2 colors, and so they'll contribute a lot less error, a lot more clarity to the experiment, and then we can weight how much we use those detectors in an attempt to actually minimize the spillover spreading. And so that completed, it was just a couple of minutes there. We've got one more matrix here, visualizing it on the same data here. Okay, so you can see, I think we got even a little bit better from our view. We can go back and forth if we want. So traditional, spectral, spectral optimized. So maybe looking at populations like these, for example, where on traditional, they go off the bottom of the screen. Spectral, they're a little tighter on screen. Optimized, they're even a little tighter, a little rounder, a little more lined up and so forth. Okay, and then we can check out the SSM for that, and we're down to 118, and we've got all of our values under that threshold of 10 that I just, again, my personal threshold that I like. Another question here. It seems that you're having unmixing inaccuracy in the full stained. Are you able to correct it in FlowJo? Do you know if the modification you apply affects the FlowJo SSM calculation from the spectral matrix? Okay, we will not import the unmixed spectral matrix as something that you can modify in FlowJo. We will bring in the unmixed data, and we will bring in the comp controls if you have a spectral cytometer that was unmixed. And so you can either use the spectral matrix that came with it, or recalculate it in FlowJo. If the inaccuracy was something to do with the handling of figuring out, positive and negative examples and so forth, we will totally be able to help with that. Additionally, the optimization process we do, well, Spectral overall has some optimization built in that since it's an over-determined system of equations, we'll use generally something like linear least squares to figure out what the best combination of parameters is that solves the spillover problem. But our optimization step in the end is something that's additional that I think only we do at this point. And so I think you can actually make data that came off a spectral cytometer even slightly better if you use our algorithms. So probably, Olivier, depending on what the inaccuracy was. Okay, so here we've got all 3 matrices. We can see that we go from a traditional with an SSM value at just about 200, all the way down to a spectral optimized SSM value of just over 100. So a pretty dramatic effect. Data is all previewed on a single sample, and then to apply it, either one of these, we can drag the M either from this window where we were starting to work with it over here, or from the assignment window, and then have spectrally compensated data. I'm going to have just applied it to the same one that's being previewed here. Okay. So that is spectral compensation just on a 9-color 20 detector set. And I will mention that I've specifically picked out a set that is a fairly crazy panel. And this is definitely worth pointing out. Going back to data and just looking at what we have in here, and even if we looked at the uncomped, they're all violet dyes. It's an all violet panel. Sorry, double clicked. So all violets. And so I've intentionally picked a panel where spectral should make a big difference. I think one of the biggest points that I can make just in regards to spectral cytometry in general is that good panel design still matters. If we had picked a panel that had very little spillover, there's just not a whole lot to optimize then, and traditional and spectral cytometry or optimized spectral compensation will all produce much, much more similar values. And so a little bit of a, cherry picking a data set that was actually designed with a crazy panel, just to really show the benefit of if you've got, if you've got some problem data, and it's unlikely in your experiment that every one of your colors will potentially be a problem interaction, but maybe there'll be one or two. And then I think spectral cytometry can really help there. So just to, temper expectations, if it's a great panel, the data will look good almost no matter what you do. Okay, question from Tillman. How many extra parameters does one need to have that it makes sense to use spectral compensation? Well, if you've got even one extra detector, you can use spectral compensation and you'll get something out of it. More is more in this case. The more channels that we can collect light in, the better. One of the benefits of doing spectral cytometry, of having all those detectors collecting for all the parameters, that you should just get brighter data. You should just collect more photons overall and get better separation, because then we'll sum all those photons back up into one parameter, whether it was called, say, FITSI on CD3 or something like that, even though we've collected across detectors 1 to 20. So at least +1 on top of the number of the parameters you have. At best, again, more is better in this case. There's probably a few, I know just from having looked at a number of data, it's probably worth taking a look at how adding, one more, say, long pass filter, for example, affects your data if it collects a big wide range of light. I've seen occasionally like one extra parameter make it a little bit worse, but generally more is more. Okay, so I have one other example to show in this webinar, just to show, do I have that one open already? Oh, I think I do. Okay, so this is just data off a spectral cytometer. So, we can work with that as well. Same deal, there are, let's see, this is a 16 color panel. I went to the trouble of, since some of the controls are beads and some are cells, putting a cleanup group that varies between cells and beads already, so we don't have to watch somebody in a webinar go through and make sure that lines up. So data off a spectral cytometer, we can just use a reference group here. Let's see, I have a question. Should you ever move the gating on the compensation graphs if you don't see negative and positive separation until you see the separation, or leave it how it is automatically gated? Well, I think you will definitely sometimes need to adjust the gating. Now let's see, adjusting the gating won't help you see negative and positive separation, right? So negative and positive separation are just a good spacing between your negative and positive peaks. The gate is just meant to basically set a threshold to say these are the cells that I will use as my exemplar for negative to calculate MFI of background, and this is the gate I'll use to calculate the MFI of everything else of the single stained positive sample, and knowing that it should be background levels of fluorescence for everything else. So if you don't see good positive and negative, that's maybe a matter of just, maybe making sure that your titration is good on how you've labeled the comp controls, on making sure, again, you've made compensation as easy as you can on yourself by picking a particle and an antibody, or one or the other or both, that will really produce great separation and a very nice bright signal. And for just gating that you disagree with, and I'm sure we're going to see once I hit compensation, once I hit the go button here, we'll see a few gates we disagree with. You'll really just want to make sure that you've got your gates wide enough to, to get the peaks, and that they're, are on the proper peaks and so forth. Let's see, I've got the QA box. I see there's 2 questions in. Okay, looks like we handled both of those. Nice. Let's see. Okay, Anna, thank you. Very nice. Let's go to compensation here. Okay, same deal. I've got many detectors, many more detectors than I have parameters. I'm going to select them all. Make sure I got those first 2. No, I missed one. Okay, get them all. Choose select the parameters. Okay, this will think for a moment. There goes our compensation. Same deal again. We've now got, 30 detectors going. So basically only every other one has, a sample assigned. I'm going to remove the unused, get down to something like this. I will say a few of these cell controls were a little sketchy in this experiment. Let's see. Please read the questions being as well. That way we can get a good grasp on the answers. Oh, okay, gotcha. Yes, yes, indeed. I think I have done that. I will make sure I do that explicitly. All right. So speaking of moving gates, this might be one here. Let's see. Well, first, let's just scroll down and see how we're doing. I'm going to claim I took a peek at this. The bead controls, I think, were all really nice. The cell controls were a bit more iffy and they might need some adjustment. So let's do that. Let's make a few adjustments to these cell controls. This one, yeah, let's pick the positive peak and the negative peak and assume that's as best as we can do with this control. We could potentially have moved the cleanup gate around to see if it resolves potentially. Well, maybe this was a, yeah, then we lose our negatives. I was going to say potentially this was a marker for, yeah, I'm not sure, a marker for monocytes. Try some dead cells. Well, let's stick with that. Good enough for demo work. All right, moving down to our next cell-based control. Let's tighten up that negative peak. Assume that is our positive peak and the rest of it's a shoulder. You as the owner of your experiments will know the data better than the publicly available data I'm using. Let's make sure we get the nice peak there. And FlowJo made a judgment call there to say that was a shoulder, but let's include a little more of that. There's a lot of cells there. Okay, I will say that is good enough. Okay, again, to do spectral, we'll check on the spectral box, rename the calculation, the compensation if you'd like to, and hit view matrix. Okay. So we've got, again, in this one fully stained tube, I think I put a cleanup gate on it. I did not. Let's find that and do some kind of cleanup gate on that. Scatter area versus side scatter area just for general purpose. Let's see what we got there. Okay, and then we can turn off the uncomped if we'd like. We can see that there was a lot of compensation in here. All right, we can calculate an SSM. So our SSM is bigger panel, 174. Okay, another question here. How do you decide to set row positive and negative gate? Your positive negative gate? Are you focusing on the brightest values? Is it using the medians of the population to calculate? Yes, yes indeed. So what you're hoping for, it's either Oliver or Olivier. We're going to go with Olivier and hope. Okay, Olivier, what we're hoping for is that there is a clear, obvious negative and positive example. And if we look back at the data, particularly for our bead comp controls, we have that. You know, most of these beads, there's just one big peak. And so that's super easy. That's what we are attempting to do. And if we have really set like a very good comp control up, we'll get it. And then it's easy. You know, there's no thought at all. And an algorithm should identify that properly 99.9% of the time. And that's what you would like to do for cells as well. Remembering that compensation is the control for your fluorescent probes, not for, you know, is this healthy versus diseased, or did this antibody bind, or anything else. It's the control for your fluorescent probes. You can set up cell-based compensation also to give you very clear resolution on the peaks. You know, you could say attach, I don't know, CD45 to every color if you wanted, and you would get some pretty good, you know, positive, negative, easy to see populations and do a very similar process. Where the compensation control isn't so good, let's look back at that first one here. That's where the person doing the compensation here has to make a guess. So I definitely want the brightest fluorescent peak to be my example of positive, and probably the smallest one should be negative. And so hey, this one I'm guessing that those are negatives. I think I have an unstained cells in this data set. Yeah, I do, unstained cells. So I don't really have to guess there actually. I could have made some kind of gate as a cleanup and then checked out, you know, that particular E13 just to make sure. I could even have used this as a I could even have used this as a universal negative, perhaps, and maybe that would have been smart, or at least smart for at least one of these files. Let's see, I think that's going to be about the same in the end. We can drag that in if we'd like and use it as our negative. And I called it lymphocytes. I mean, oh well. Unstained, sure. Okay, so that actually, that's a little dimmer there, a little dimmer. So anyway, yeah, you're trying to just make sure that you've got cells that you're pretty sure are negative. And so unstained is a great choice there. And then cells that are as bright as you're going to see in your data. Where I found that little shoulder peak, wherever it was on one of these. Yeah, there's just a blip there, for example. So I didn't choose that to be my positive. I was assuming that was just a little bit of noise, maybe a couple doublets stuck together. It might be brighter than I might actually see. Some maybe a better, more attention to my cleanup gates or some better comp controls might help with that. So generally trying to find the brightest possible peak and just include it. And we do calculate MFI. And so if you make these gates a little wider, a little smaller, you can see the green dotted line here. That's the MFI of that population. It's calculated. If I make this a bit wider, I make this a lot wider, it doesn't do a whole lot to changing the median. The median is a pretty robust statistic. So anyway, once we calculate the MFIs, if we've got a background population, we're just trying to make sure that the MFI of background, the MFI of all the things that we have not attached to a single stain control end up being equal. Okay, and question, it may be CD56 high population in B13. That's why I asked. Okay, then your guess is as good as mine on what that is. I don't have a whole lot of info on what's actually in this data. Okay, so back over here. Oh, let's see, one more question. While analyzing data using spectral comp, if we notice a particular parameter gets overcompensated / undercompensated during spectral mixing, can we go back to check single color controls and edit the spectral comp matrix as we can do during traditional comp analysis? Yes, absolutely. I definitely suggest that if you see something that's overcompensated, editing the matrix itself is, especially as these matrices get big, is a bit of, a bit of a whack-a-mole game. You can adjust one and see a lot of others get worse. The best approach definitely is to go back into these comp controls, look through, review. We can even, just make a new matrix up here, try it again, make sure that you agree with all the gate choices, that perhaps everything that was assigned is assigned to the proper, as the proper control. I think going back and just revisiting the setup itself is the best way to go about looking at ways to correct unmixed versus mixed. And then just double check things like, was my control sample as bright as the actual data file that I wanted to look at? I think that's one of the easiest places where you can set up what appear to be really good comp controls that maybe don't totally represent the data that they're being applied to. It's easy to accidentally get something that doesn't quite bind as well in your comp controls as it does in your real data. Okay, I have not optimized this one. We can, this is 16 color. This will take slightly longer then. So let's hit optimize. We can chit chat some more, answer a few more questions. The optimization process, again, will depend on the number of colors you're trying to optimize. The more colors you have, the more detectors you have, the bigger the matrix is, the more places to optimize. The one that was a 9 color, 20 detector matrix took a minute to optimize. I believe this one takes maybe 3 minutes, something like that, to analyze, to optimize, and then we can check what the effects on the SSM are. Okay, overall, that's what I have. That's what I intended to show today. That you can do spectral comp just by bringing in your comp controls, and the process is just about the same as with traditional compensation, and that using the optimize tool, you can improve your matrix even a bit more, maybe even a bit more than other comparable methods. And so I highly recommend giving this a try if you've got a few extra detectors on your cytometer. If it is not already configured to be a spectral cytometer, generally the process for doing spectral comp isn't just leave a channel or two open, but it's attempting to line up your filters so that you cover the maximum amount of the light spectrum, as opposed to targeting your filters to specific parameters. Minimize this. Bring this up. Okay, other questions while we optimize? All right, Q&A looks good, and the chat box looks good. So expect this to complete relatively soon. You can see as it is calculating, we're down to a 163 total SSM sum. At any point during this calculation, you can hit cancel to stop and just accept however good it's done at that point. I do recommend letting it finish. Generally only an extra minute or two, and you can get the best possible outcome. All right. That seems to be about done. I'm not seeing any big changes in the SSM sum at this point. Okay, well then. Let's see, a question has popped in. Hi, John. Sorry, I joined late. What does cleanup mean? So cleanup is, oh, there goes that optimized. Cleanup is just the term I was using as a first pass threshold gate, just to get cells of similar size and complexity roughly by forward and side scatter to be used as my exemplars for compensation, so that I would have cells with roughly the same amount of autofluorescence as a basis. Let's see, we have another question. Did you compare a Visney plot coming from the same file, but one compensated with a square matrix and the other with a rectangular matrix? Could you comment the differences if they are? You know, I have not done that. It's something we could look at. I probably will not do this on this webinar. We will run t-SNE. Visney is a visualization of SNE, so it's a clustering applied on top of t-SNE. We could do t-SNE, we could use a variety of clustering algorithms in FlowJo. That is probably getting a bit off topic, but worth looking at. What I would expect to see is if we've got tighter populations, if we've got less spread, that should do nothing but help any kind of t-SNE visualization. Another question, I might have missed it before. Can I perform spectral compensation with data recorded from any cytometer, assuming I have more detectors than parameters? Yes, Stefania, absolutely. Spectral cytometry just means that you are collecting all the channels in all the detectors. And so you would have to configure your cytometer to do that. You would probably want to have your detectors, again, open for all parameters and also lined up so you cover the most visible space, as opposed to a lot of times if we're just doing traditional cytometry, we'll try to pick detectors that match the parameter we're going for. So yeah, you can configure basically any cytometer to do spectral cytometry. From Tillman, so to sum up, you say never change the matrix, but go back to the comp controls and optimize those. Pretty much. You have the ability to change the matrix. It's easier to do on smaller matrices, and there will certainly be the expert cytometrist who knows that they're using like GFP or something that is really tough to get a great control for, and they have to make a 1% tweak every time. So there's always exceptions to the rules, but yeah, pretty much. I wouldn't change the matrices. Question on, can we subtract autofluorescence? We do not do that as of yet. Again, we're not, we've been considering the best ways to do that. Autofluorescence will vary from cell to cell to cell, calculating on a per cell basis autofluorescence, trying to figure out what kind of cell it is. It'll be a very slow process, calculating it by coming up with basically an average or a baseline or a lowest level autofluorescence. That would be doable. We've been trying to decide if it's good science. I think it'll be okay to do that, and we probably will. The purpose of using the optimized weight, which is a question, what is the purpose of it? The question of using the optimized weights is to present the idea that not all detectors are presenting equally good information. Some of the detectors will be a bit messy. There'll be a lot of signal from a lot of different fluors in that detector, and it'll be really tough to get a good mixing based on that. Other detectors will have very clean signals. Maybe they've gotten color from one specific fluor, or maybe just two or something like that. And so if we weight their inputs a little higher than the inputs of the messier detectors, we can actually reduce the spillover spreading matrix. And so we attempt to do that And I should also point out, if you want to see what the weights were, hit the weights button. If you click it before hitting optimize, they'll all be 1.0. But so we could assume that, detector V8 was a little bit better than average, and V15 a little worse than average. And so we weight one a little more, a little less, and you can then overall optimize your matrix by just using the better, cleaner detector signals with more, more weight to them than the rest of the detectors. And you can then, if we make the assessment of optimization, SSM, which seems to be the best method currently to assess goodness of a compensation matrix, SSM spillover spreading matrix, then you can, well, so this one is optimized. We've got our spillover down, our total spillover spreading down to 162, whereas previously it was 174. So we've taken a little bit of the overall spillover out of this data and made just cleaner looking data. Let's see, another question. I have a 24 color panel on Symphony using all violet, ultraviolet, red, yellow, green, and a few channels in blue laser. This is not off of spectral cytometer. I use beads for compensation on the Diva software. Q1, when you comp and do spectral and apply the matrix to your fully stained sample, can you apply to the already comped data? Yes. If not, do you have to remove the Diva comp before you apply it? Q2, your cleanup gate is only on one population, but for my 24 color panel with over 20 different populations with separate autofluorescence, do I need to have several cleanup gates? No. Okay, that was the one word answer to both of those questions. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so question one, any cytometer, geez, beyond like the fax scan or the fax caliber, any cytometer that writes FCS 3.0 data, and you can even use those older ones and just do your comp totally in FlowJo, we'll keep the data and the comp matrix separate. So in this workspace here, I've got a compensation matrix, the gray one's being used here. There was an acquisition defined matrix on this data set. I can say I've always got the raw data written, and I've got the compensation matrix as a separate entity in the FCS files. If I want to show this data with a different matrix, it's just a matter of dragging the M to a file or to a group, and we'll apply that matrix, that new matrix, to the raw data. And when you show it, it'll show it with that compensation matrix. So I think that's one of the real big changes to FCS 3 data was that raw data is always available, always present, which allows you to show the data with a different compensation matrix, and at any point say, reapply the acquisition matrix to the group if you'd like to, just by a right-click option there, or by clicking on the acquisition defined and just dragging and dropping the M. This was data off a spectral cytometer that was unmixed on the cytometer as well. And so this is just a fake matrix, and it's basically an identity matrix, so not much worth comparing there. So question 2 was all different populations in your data. So yeah, that's almost always the case with cytometry data. It'll be rare, unless you're doing a cell line, that everything will be the same type of cell. That cleanup gate that I had mentioned and show are on all these files, which we used to make sure that we had cells of the same basic size and granularity, was to get down to cells with even autofluorescence. Not a specific autofluorescence, but just even autofluorescence. So that when we attempt to match up background fluorescences with the fluorescence of colors that we didn't add to a single stain comp control, as long as we're calculating that on the same, things with the same autofluorescence, it'll basically cancel out. And you'll end up with a percent subtraction. So if I've got some amount of fluorescence, I take 2% of it out because that's where I think the noise came from, or that was the contribution of this color in that detector, talking spectral. And so it'll all be relative to the type or the size of the cell that you're using. So compensation in general, spectral or traditional, is set up to be applied across many different populations. Let me just take a quick peek in the QA box. I see there are a few questions there. I think most of them also appeared in the chat. Okay, there was one on, I missed how you got the window with optimize. So optimize is just in the main compensation window. It's just the optimize weight button there that is only on, of course, if it's spectral, and you just click the optimize button. And then to see the weights after you have run optimization, you just hit the weights button and you will see whatever the weights are. You can import or export weights if you've run some kind of algorithm previously outside of FlowJo, and you have some weighting in mind that you'd like to apply. Let's see. Let's see if it says, so a question from Laura, who is trying to run spectral compensation along with us in the webinar. Nice job, Laura. Go you. She's having a problem. What does it say if it says calculation error? So right here in your comp matrix where it says finalized here, if one of your samples, if we don't have a negative or a positive gate, for example, if we go in, I don't know, here and clear it, it'll say calculation error. So likely what that means, Laura, is that take a look down your list. There was probably one sample or two, whatever, that we were unable to auto gate either a negative or a positive for, that you might have to go in and either draw a gate or pick one out of the list of what to use. Another question from Laura. I have problems visualizing in the charts the green range and the blue range. Okay. Let's see. I have trouble visualizing. What I guess is what you mean there is that it's hard to figure out where those ranges should begin and end. If it's a good comp control, then it's easy. If it's a tough comp control, where like this one, where there's, what is that middle peak? I don't know. It's supposed to be a single stain control. But anyway, you'll have to make your best guess on the brightest and the dimmest peak. Let's see. All right, Laura says, I think that overcompensated parameters are shown in the charts below the 0 in the x-axis. Could you tell me how I can move the shade in order to have all samples above 0? Let's see. So I think what we mean here, the overcompensated parameters are shown in the charts below the 0 in the x-axis. We're talking about this plot here, still setting up the compensation. These will be uncomped at this point. If we're talking about over here, then these would be compensated. And so, let's see, you wouldn't want to move the data so much. The overcomp will push it down. You'd want to make sure that your compensation's good. You'd want to go back and check everything about your plots here to make sure that it was okay, and see if you can see if there was any kind of errors that were causing overcompensation. Let's see, David Morris asks, do you need to collect all parameters on your comp controls also? So yes, yeah, because you're going to want to see for your comp controls, okay, you're only putting one floor into it. We've only added FTSE to this one, but you want to see all the parameters collected so you know how much FTSE spilled into, or if it's spectral, fluoresced across all the other detectors. So if it's spectral, you want all the detectors on for all the parameters. If it's traditional, then you are going to want to collect those parameters just to see what the spillover was. And then, you know, the real gain on spectral is that you're getting the full FTSE signal wherever it fluoresced across all of the detectors that you have. All right, question from, is clean up gates a must? Please elaborate a bit on that and also show how we can apply it in compensation matrix. Okay, cleanup gates, yes, a must. Related to the question that was asked before by Mawish, in that we would like to use cleanup gates so that we can make sure we're handing the algorithm cells that are about the same size and complexity so that we have equal amounts of autofluorescence being contributed by our exemplars of positive and our exemplars of negative. As long as we've done that, that means that the autofluorescence will cancel out in the calculations, that our compensation is the percent subtraction, and that we can then apply our compensation across various cell types, not just to one specific cell type. And so yeah, compensation definitely will need some cleanup gates. They are being applied at this point in our analysis where we have them drawn. So in this case, this is a sample using both the positive and negative from one bead cleanup gate here. And if we wanted to use something else, you can always double click. You can edit this by moving it around if you want. You'll see that does terrible things to my comp control, so we don't really want to do that. There are the single beads, but you can always draw any other gates you want. If we've missed it, We'll call it not this one. But for that particular sample, we could then go in and, oops, we could either use the negative that the algorithm identified, or we could use not this one. And, you know, wouldn't work as well, particularly, but you can edit and apply those cleanup gates however you want. The algorithm should do a pretty good job of drawing them automatically for you. It should do a really good job if they're beads, and generally a pretty good job if they're cells, particularly cells with a good strong peak. The one place where FlowJo will struggle a little bit is if you were doing, I don't know, say a monocyte panel where all your markers were monocyte antibodies, but there were tons and tons of lymphocytes, so there were way more lymphocytes, but way fewer monocytes, but brighter peaks, and the algorithm has to try to balance its selection there. So definitely if you have a monocyte panel, give it a look, make sure that you know, comp controls have the proper cleanup gates put on. Okay. Iman says, how SSM is influenced by the compensation matrix while it is supposed to reflect the machine sensitivity. Shouldn't the SSM matrix be constant in all experiments? Isn't it machine specific? So it is definitely affected by the machine, but it is also affected by the fluorescent dyes themselves. You can imagine that two dyes with very similar spectra will cause more spreading error than two dyes that are very far apart on the light spectrum. So it is a combination actually of the machine and the dyes. Mariana says, does the spectral compensation by analyzing the fluorescence of one fluorochrome in multiple channels better to detect dim populations? Yes. Or it doesn't change the separation of positive and negative. Actually, it should improve. If you're doing spectral compensation, rather than only collect the light from a fluor that goes into one detector and trying to filter out all of the rest of it, we'll take the light in all of the detectors and sum it up basically. And so you will do a better job separating dim, negative and positive, and you should also get brighter dim populations. So I actually think that's one of the strengths of spectral cytometry. Let's see. We have a question on Tillman. What about negative comp values? Okay, so in this plot, we can see there are a handful of negative comp values. FlowJo highlights them light blue. Some acquisition softwares will allow negative comp, some don't. We will. What a negative comp value means is that, so we attempt to balance the MFI of background and the MFI of single positive for your single stain comp controls. Sometimes you will get a distribution that's not 100% normal. It'll have a little bit of skew to it. So imagine trying to line up two Gaussians. Now, theoretically, the Gaussians, if they're from the same population, should have the exact same median, the same central tendency, the same spread, etc. If when you collect the data, you got a little bit of skew, maybe one Gaussian, even though it's supposed to be the exact same, is skewed a little bit down, and actually then to compensate and make them even, sorry, a little bit, whatever, more fluorescent, you have to almost do negative compensation. You have to bring it back a little bit. So if we see tiny numbers like -0.3, -0.4, -0.4, etc., that just means there is a minuscule amount of skew. The algorithm put in a tiny negative number to line up and make this exactly perfect in terms of the MFI alignment. We could replace all those with zeros and it would make absolutely no difference in your data. So it's really just up to whether you want to allow that to be or not. It doesn't really matter much. If you would see a very large negative number, if one of these was like -10, -15, something like that, that would imply that something actually went terribly wrong. That probably one of the controls was way off, was, who knows, actually stained with multiple colors or just assigned to the wrong detector or something to that effect. But basically a small negative value, nothing to worry about. Just means a little skew in the data collection. A handful more cells were collected, slightly below the median than above, whatever it might be. So not a big problem. Large negative numbers, problem. Let's see how we doing here. Looking at both the Q&A box and the chat box, I think I've caught up. Fantastic. Extra good since we're running out of time. It is 1:54. Okay. I think, well, let me just give it one last round of questions before Microsoft attempts to auto-update. No, Microsoft, not the moment. We're in the middle of a webinar. Okay, cool. I think we've caught up all the questions. We're at 5 minutes left. Let's see. I think let us wrap it up then. So everyone, wow. I appreciate everyone who stuck it out. Almost everybody, really, really cool. Thank you for attending our online spectral cytometry in FlowJo. Got something popping up in the chat. Oh, and a thank you. Well, I appreciate all of you. Awesome. Oh, and a question from Mawish that says, I was trying the spectral with my panel. I don't see the sum at the end as you mentioned. Is there something I'm missing? Make sure the only place that will give a sum is through the SSM. And so if you click the SSM and display that, that will have a sum at the very bottom. And oh, you're welcome, Carol. And that will have a sum as opposed to the actual spillover matrix, which will not. Well, thank you all. I appreciate the compliments. Yes, the seminar will be available online. It usually takes not too long, something in the line of 15, 20 minutes for Zoom to give us a link to the cloud recording of this thing. And as soon as we see that, we will post it. All right, Tillman, thank you as well. All right, this was a pleasure. Take care. Have a great day, great weekend coming up soon. And until we talk again.